Okay. So we discussed in the last class that we had, we discussed Ecclesiastes from the basis of the writer. To say that that is debated is an understatement, but a lot of that mainly resides around or revolves around the language of Ecclesiastes. The original Hebrew of Ecclesiastes is very unique. And as a result, it has a lot of scholars suggesting that this is a post-exilic writing, written kind of in a pseudo way with the voice of Solomon, but written by somebody after the exile. And I wanted to mention a couple things that Garrett mentioned, because he goes through all of this. And if you want a copy of some of this or to be able to look at it, he goes through the authorship, date of composition, the arguments for why people say it wasn't Solomon. And I'm not going to go through all of it. It's really interesting, though. They go to the language of it. They go to internal evidence to suggest that it wasn't Solomon. But what's really interesting is when he starts refuting the basis upon which people deny that Solomon wrote it. The linguistic evidence. He says the question of the language of Ecclesiastes has naturally received the most attention. In answer to Delitzsch's, and this is one of the scholars that he mentions earlier, often quoted remark regarding Ecclesiastes and the history of the Hebrew language, one might note that our knowledge of the particulars of the history of Hebrew is quite limited. I don't know if you've ever had the opportunity to take a look at Vine's dictionary of the Old and New Testament terms, and the comparison between the Old Testament and the New Testament, and how much smaller the Old Testament dictionary is for the Hebrew terms, simply because there's not a lot of continual recognition of history of the Hebrew. We've got the writings of Moses, we've got the writings of the prophets and so forth, but there's not a lot of external association of the Hebrew. So there's a lot less of a sample size, I guess you could say, to be able to go to and see how everything had progressed, the language and the dialects and so forth. For Greek, the history of the dialectical, orthographic, lexical development of the language is well documented. Indisputable evidence concerning the history of the Hebrew language, however, is relatively scarce. Eaton remarks that the difficulty is that the linguistic data show that Ecclesiastes does not fit into any known section of the history of the Hebrew language. And that's the point, is that they're suggesting that this is a post-exile thing because we don't have any other example of it. But that's not entirely accurate. To use that as a basis to say that Solomon didn't write Ecclesiastes, that ignores all of the other history of the Hebrew language, particularly at the point in time that Solomon would have written this. This would have been literally at the end of his life. And we know that right after he died, just shortly after, that's when the kingdom split. So we had Rehoboam and Jeroboam, and you had the nation of Judah, just the two tribes, and then you had the other 10 tribes of Israel, and they split. And certainly the dialects and the mode of Hebrew was in the midst of change all during that process. I wanted to mention also the fact that he says, the peculiar Hebrew of Ecclesiastes cannot be evidence for a late date, since it does not fit anywhere in the known history of the language. In other words, you can't use that as evidence to say that must be it. In no way, for example, does it specifically resemble the Hebrew of Malachi, Esther, or of the chronicler. Which is to say, it's not the same as early Hebrew like Moses. It's not the same as the Hebrew of post-exile either. It's somewhere in the middle, which ironically, the date of Ecclesiastes and Solomon writing it at the end of his life puts it right dab in the middle of that spectrum. And so to be able to definitively say, the Hebrew obviously must have been after the exile, that's not accurate at all. He also talks about the internal evidence regarding Solomon being the writer. He says internal evidence cannot be said to demand non-Solomonic authorship of the book. The use of the perfect tense in chapter 1, verse 12 proves nothing. And that's, and I'll go there real quick. It's where Solomon says, I was the king in Jerusalem, here in verse 12. He says, I, the preacher, was king over Israel in Jerusalem. Notice, remember, Jerusalem ended up being the capital of Judah after the split. So it wouldn't have been accurate to say he was king over Israel in Jerusalem if this was after Solomon. It would have been, I was king over Judah in Jerusalem. To say that it was anybody before, well, he particularly says in verse 1 that he's the son of David. So that puts it a very specific time frame. Who was a man who was a son of David, but while Jerusalem was the capital of Israel. And it's hard to get past that. Certainly does not establish that we here have a later author writing on behalf of the now dead Solomon. That's one of the theories, that somebody wrote it and they just put Solomon's name on it. It may indicate that Ecclesiastes was written by an aged Solomon near the end of his life. Throughout the book, in fact, the perspective seems to be that of an older man, as in the description of old age in chapter 12, nor is it clear that texts like chapter 8 or chapter 10 or chapter 12 abandon Solomon's authorship. That's one of the arguments. Well, Solomon writes this, but he writes it not from the perspective of a king. It's like he's a totally different person. That's because he's writing it from the perspective of a wise man, not from a king. And that's why he separates himself from being Solomon the king and tries to present the things that he says as Solomon the wise man. And so when he says in verse 12, he was king, does that mean he isn't anymore? No, it's just an idea that he had enjoyed all these pleasures of life that he's going to talk about in Ecclesiastes while he was king in Jerusalem. Now he's at the end of his life, he's approaching death, he can see death on the horizon, and he's looking back, I was king over Israel, and here's what I experienced during that time, especially when we know that he fell away from God, when he was following after the false gods of his wives. And so it's not a suggestion that he is no longer in somebody else's king now. That's not at all what it's saying. Certainly we cannot say that a king could not have reflected critically on a king's role and on appropriate behavior in the royal presence. He talks about kings kind of in the third person, describing to people how to treat the king, how to talk to the king, and so forth. And the argument is, well, why would Solomon say that if he is king? Well, because wisdom goes hand in hand with that. How you treat authority, how you submit to that authority is an important part of wisdom. In fact, to a certain extent, just like in Proverbs, how you have wisdom speaking in essence, is Solomon writing it, but it's as if wisdom is speaking herself. In fact, wisdom is referred to as she. Here in Ecclesiastes, Solomon kind of does the same type of situation where wisdom is speaking regarding these different relationships in life, and especially as the example here of towards authority. And Garrett even makes a great point in that later, post-exile, they didn't have kings over Israel. They didn't have that association with that power structure the way they did before the exile. So why would someone post-exile write wisdom and advice about how to deal with authority, how to treat authority and kings, if nobody in Israel had any association with the idea of what a kingship was all about, given the fact that they were being ruled from abroad? And I thought that was a great point from Garrett as well. And then the last thing I wanted to mention, so there's 3 different levels of discourse that Solomon kind of goes through as he writes this. And that very point is what was used to say, well, obviously Solomon couldn't have written this. It had to be someone else who took some of Solomon's words and then edited or added to it. Okay? In Ecclesiastes, we have not just 2 discourse levels of the frame narrator, that would be the editor, and the teacher, but 3 levels of discourse. The first level, that of the frame narrator, is found where the teacher is referred to in the third person in chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. At this level, the reader learns something about the character and background of the teacher. That's Solomon. More importantly, and that's the reference to I. More importantly, the biographical details of this level place the teacher in the realm of history and set a degree of objectivity and distance between the reader and the teacher, a distance that would not exist if the entire book were written in the first person. The frame narrator thus lifts the book above the level of personal reflection and presents the teacher as an authority whose words ought to be heard. So that's the first perspective in which Ecclesiastes is written. It's being written referring to the teacher. And as such, because he is a teacher, and particularly a teacher of wisdom, you need to listen to what he says. The second level of discourse is the wisdom level, at which we are not in the realm of biography and history, but neither are we in the realm of the teacher's personal opinions. Rather, the nature of reality is described in terms that are universal. Wisdom is speaking. Here, the text frequently employs a poetic or aphoristic style associated with the book of Proverbs in order to describe the nature of the world, to give direction or insight. At this level, the book speaks with authority, and the reader is to accept its teachings as corresponding to reality. Then the third level is the first-person recollections. Here the teacher invites the reader both to learn from the teacher's experiences. This is when he starts talking about, here's what I did, here's what I enjoyed, here's what I learned from this experience and the mistakes of my past I hope you'll learn from. Both to learn from the teacher's experiences and to join him in confronting life's lessons, however brutal they may be at times. The first level thus gives us something of the external world and person of the teacher. Second level gives us the wisdom teachings that make up the framework. And the third level gives us his personal meditations and what his lessons were based on his experience. He says, what is important to grasp here is that all the levels of narration are a matter of literary technique and are not indications of redaction history, which is to say that somebody later took Solomon's words, edited them, moved them, or changed them, or took them out, or whatever. The reason they all flow together so well is that they are all part of the single perspective of a single author. The frame narrator, wisdom, and the teacher are all masks behind which we hear the voice of one author, and that, of course, is Solomon. So I thought that was really interesting how that he deals with all of the arguments made about Ecclesiastes, whether or not it truly is part of the Word of God or not, because ultimately that's what it would boil down to. It presents itself as being the writings of Solomon. You can't get around that. But if it really isn't, then somebody faked it. That would suggest that it doesn't belong in the Bible. And that's not at all, and that's what Garrett deals with, is that's not accurate to say that. Then the other thing he said, sorry, I thought that was the last thing, and it's not. This is the last thing. Among Christians, many, and this is Christians throughout history, the people who wrote historical stuff like Melito and Origen and Jerome, they explicitly refer to Ecclesiastes as being God's word. The argument is groundless that the failure of the New Testament writers to mention Ecclesiastes proves that they did not accept it. That was one of the arguments. Remember we talked about a couple weeks ago that Ecclesiastes isn't quoted in the New Testament. And the argument against Solomon writing Ecclesiastes is that, well, that means the apostles must not have recognized it as being God's word. That's why they didn't quote it. Garrett said, that doesn't mean anything. The subject matter of Ecclesiastes makes it unlikely that the New Testament authors would have had occasion to mention it. The New Testament viewpoint would be significant only if it rejected Ecclesiastes. There are other books in the Old Testament that are never quoted in the New Testament. Does that mean, therefore, that those are not God's word too? No. That's ridiculous to say that. That's why Garrett says it would only matter if something in the New Testament specifically said, these words written here in this book, they were never written by God, or something to that effect. And so I thought that was important also. Okay, so that's all from Garrett that I wanted to mention on some of that background, because we did talk about that. I didn't go into a lot of detail, and I thought it might be, if you want more specifics, if you ever come across somebody who, granted this is, I guess, more of a scholarly concept than it is maybe just a common discussion about God's Word. But if you do come across somebody that argues, well, Ecclesiastes isn't part of the Bible, it wasn't written by Solomon, blah, 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 that you have a basis to be able to say that's not the case. That's not true. Yes, ma'am?
It just might be me, but who is this Garrett that you keep referring to?
This is Dwayne Garrett. It's one of the commentaries that I use. We used it with Song of Solomon, or Song of Solomon. And I really appreciate the fact, because he is a scholar and expert in Old Testament poetry. And so when he writes these things regarding Old Testament poetry, like Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon's writings, he has a lot of expertise in what he's talking about. And he goes through it and he lays it out very clearly. I'm not saying everything he says is right. There's certain things that I'm like, I'm not sure about that, especially with Song of Solomon. But I really appreciate his viewpoint, especially in maintaining the integrity of Ecclesiastes, for instance. So, and he's not the only one. There are others as well. But a lot of commentators have gone so far as to say that Ecclesiastes shouldn't be in the Bible because it wasn't written by Solomon. And that's not true. There's no reason to believe that. There's no reason to say that. Okay. Anything regarding the introduction to our notes? We talked about the lessons to be learned. Pride needs to be abandoned. Life should be enjoyed for what it is as a gift of God. And the lesson of having respect and reverence for God. That ultimately is the overarching lessons of Ecclesiastes. And it provides a proper perspective on life. When people read Ecclesiastes, they read it in a pessimistic way. They read it and they say, this just makes me feel like life doesn't mean anything. Nothing could be further from the truth. That is not at all what Solomon's saying. In fact, if anything, the book of Ecclesiastes is actually an encouragement because it helps us to remember what's important. And that's really what this is. It's about priorities and it's about perspective. And remembering that in the midst of how chaotic our lives can get, we can become distracted by the stuff here, that we forget what our goal is and why we're here to begin with. Okay, so Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 1, he says, the words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Notice, this is the perfect tense, or third person. He doesn't refer to himself as me or I until verse 12. Okay? But there's a reason for that. There's a purpose for that. He's establishing himself as Solomon the wise man as opposed to Solomon the king, and this is a royal decree. Okay? He wants to put this in the realm of wisdom and knowledge. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. Right off the bat, verse 2. Well, great, nothing means anything, nothing matters. Okay? But Solomon's going to define what he means by this. Does anybody know what the term vanity means? Empty, useless, without profit. Can somebody turn to Psalm 144, verse 4, and read that for us? Psalm 144, verse 4.
Man is like a breath, his days are like a passing shadow.
Is that verse 4?
144, 4.
Yeah. Say it. Read it again.
Man is like a breath, his days are like a passing shadow.
Okay. Yeah. The passing shadow part is what translation you have? Is that the New King James? English Standard? Okay, so notice what the psalmist says in verse 3. What is man that you take knowledge of him, or the son of man that you are mindful of him? Man is like a breath, his days are like a passing shadow. That term in the King James, and this is the Greek term, the King James kind of uses a different way of saying it, but the term here is the same term vanity in Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 2. The same term vanity, that which is useless, that which is empty. Man is like a breath, his days like a passing shadow. That term vanity is used here to describe man's life. Not that man doesn't matter, but that in the end, there is no ultimate staying property of man. It's meaningless from the perspective of the permanence of man. Okay? This is looking at Ecclesiastes is looking at life from a physical perspective, not from a spiritual one. And that's what the emphasis of Ecclesiastes is. In Psalm 39 and in verse 5, and I think this is David. Yeah, Psalm of David. Verse 5, he says, indeed you have made my days as handbreadths, and my age is as nothing before you. Certainly man, or every man, at his best state is but, and the term here is vapor. King James has vanity. In the Hebrew, that's the exact same term as Ecclesiastes 1 verse 2. Every man in his best state is empty, is nothing. This is not a commentary on his state of having a soul or not having a soul. It's not a commentary on his spirit. It's a commentary on the flesh, that there is no staying power within man. Surely every man walks about like a shadow, verse 6. Surely they busy themselves in vain. He heaps up riches and does not know who will gather them. There in verse 6, they busy themselves in vain. Again, the same term. And it's that the purpose, the physical aspect of man, everything he does is but for a fleeting moment. Because in the end, none of it's going to last. And while that depresses some people, it provides proper perspective for us, remembering that this world is not our home. Verse 11, when with rebukes you correct man for iniquity, you make his beauty melt away like a moth. Surely every man is a vapor. Again, that term vapor, same term vanity. And again, that reference to the physical state of man is what's being referenced here. So coming back to Ecclesiastes, when he says vanity of vanities, it's as if he's approaching this from the perspective of here's the ultimate in emptiness. Here's the ultimate lack of profit. And again, from the physical perspective of man's staying power is the perspective he has. Verse 3, what profit has a man from all his labor in which he toils under the sun? Well, you provide for yourself, you provide for your family, you sustain yourself. There's profit in that. But the very next verse, he's going to start talking about nature. Okay, he's going to talk about the generation of man comes, generation of man goes, but then you compare that to nature, and nature just stays the same all the time. And it's that staying existence, that constant existence that he's comparing here. What profit has a man from all his labor which he toils under? He can't take it with him. Okay, there's nothing you can take with you with all the work you do once you die, and he's going to make the case later, whatever you've accumulated over your life is going to get dispersed among other people. There's nothing about it that lasts. Verse 4, one generation passes away, and another generation comes, but the earth abides forever. Here's the contrast, is that man is fluid. Man is constantly coming and going, and generation after generation. But notice what he says in verse 5. The sun rises, the sun goes down. It has been that way since Adam and Eve. Hastens to the place where it arose, verse 5. Verse 6, the wind goes towards the south and turns around to the north. The wind whirls around continually and comes again on its circuit. It has been that way since Adam and Eve. Over and over. And interestingly enough, there's even some grounds upon which to make the case that Solomon knew stuff about nature that even man and science didn't understand until many, many, many generations later. Okay, the fact that the wind goes about on a circuit and it continues to come back around, that's something man didn't understand, or at least science didn't understand and acknowledge until many decades later, or many centuries later. Even the sun and its continual path and so forth, from a certain perspective, that was not completely understood either. Verse 7, all the rivers run into the sea, yet the sea is not full. To the place from which the rivers come, there they return again. Having that knowledge, that information, is indicative of having wisdom that isn't just wisdom from observation. This is certainly wisdom that God had granted him as well. The understanding of certain natural laws that exist. And it's very logical. He says, the rivers run into the sea. Well, if they're constantly running into the sea, you would think the sea would just fill up. But it doesn't. It stays the same. That means it's constantly being recycled over and over and over again. And that's why he says, to the place from which the rivers came, there they return again. Verse 8, all things are full of labor. Man cannot express it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. Despite, and it's almost as if he puts nature and creation in this contented, continual state. That God has established nature to run efficiently, to work in such a way that it has a purpose. It has a staying nature to it that only God will one day destroy. But when it comes to man, all things are full of labor. Nature's set. There's no work that nature's doing because God set it in place and the laws govern it. Man, all things are full of labor. He's constantly fighting against this and fighting against that. Fighting against old age, fighting against disease, fighting against injury. Man cannot express it. Which is to say, man can't really come to full terms with the recognition that he's mortal. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. Nature's content. It's set. It's established. It's not constantly having to create something new. God has created everything the way it's supposed to be. Whereas man is constantly seeking more. He's seeking to accumulate more. He's seeking to learn more, but he never has enough. And that's part of the vanity to which he speaks, that in the end, all of this of the flesh, it doesn't mean anything. Whether you have a PhD when you go to the grave, or you never even graduated high school when you go to the grave. In the end, that doesn't matter. That's why he eventually gets to in chapter 12. What does matter is that you fear God and keep his commandments. Anything through verse 8 so far? Yes, ma'am.
My grandfather on my dad's side was a caretaker of a cemetery in Indiana. And when we were kids, we would go up there. And I remember walking through that with my grandfather, with my father, and looking at the different headstones, who was this person? What did they do?
Yeah.
All that nobody knows because, they're gone. And that was one of those things that just struck me at that point, that all there is about you, if you look at just this life, just this earth, just the physical and not the spiritual, you're forgotten.
Yeah.
I mean, you don't make your mark. You're, a generation or two. My daughter never knew my grandparents.
Yeah.
And the one relationship that's lasting is your relationship with God.
Right.
But that's one of those things that one generation passes away and another one comes and you're forgotten.
Yeah. Has anybody ever been to those, like the World War II cemeteries with all the headstones, just as far as the eye can see, everywhere? So it's Arlington, is that the name of one of them? Just all of these, and some of them are blank because when they found the soldier, there was no means to identify. And you kind of walk through all of these headstones, you look at how many people, and of course it's all a monument, it's all a testimony to the price of freedom, right? And the willingness to sacrifice to protect what we hold dear. But those individual men and how they died and what their life was like, nobody knows that. And, I think about every time there's ever a funeral, I go through and I kind of like Debbie, I walk up and down and I kind of look for the oldest tombstone I can find. Some date back to the 1800s. There was some, at one point, I forget where I was in Texas, there was one funeral out in the middle of nowhere, and one dated back to the 17 something. And I'm just, thinking to myself what that life must have been like, what that person's experiences were. How did they die? Did they have a family? I don't know. And I would dare say probably at this point in time, nobody knows. But this is the constant state of man. There are entire generations of man's history that we know absolutely nothing about. There are gaps in our knowledge of history. There are certain things that we do based on archaeological evidence, but there's so much more we don't know. And that's our own history, and we don't remember it because a lot of it's not preserved for us. And this is what Solomon's point is. Okay, that memories of a generation last maybe for a few steps beyond. Like I remember my great-grandfather. He passed away back in 2001. But he was a good man. He was a funny man. But my kids they never met him. They don't know who he is. I talk about him every now and then, but by the time they're my age, they probably won't even remember Grandpa Kirkwood. And so that's the type of situation we live in our mortal state. And this is what Solomon's pointing out. Anything else through verse 8? Verse 9. That which has been is what will be. And that which has been done is the point, is what will be done. That's the parallel he's making here. There is nothing new under the sun. He's pointing this out because there is a third element. There's nature, which has staying power until God destroys it. There's man, which doesn't have staying power. But then what's the third element to this? Time. Time is the third element to this. Time is the kind of the overarching ruler, if you will, of this world from the perspective of time. It's constantly changing. I mean, it's constantly moving. He says that which has been is what will be. Things get recycled. Ideas get recycled. Okay, it wasn't too long ago that socialism and communism were a very negatively perceived thing, but now we're just kind of going back through a cycle again. And this is constantly happening in the world of man. He says that which is done is what will be done. Is there anything that man can do today? Okay, technology is not a part of it. In the basic human experience, is there anything that we can experience today that wasn't experienced 2,000 years ago? The means by which we interact with the world has changed a little through technology. But the basic experiences, they haven't changed. They're exactly the same. There is no temptation that has overtaken you such as is common to man, Paul told the Corinthians. It didn't matter how long man has existed. The temptations have always been the same. How the devil has dressed them up, how he has attempted to lure us with them, that has changed as technology changes and as society changes. But the temptations are still the same. Verse 10, is there anything of which it may be said, see, this is new? It has already been in ancient times before us. Idea, see, this is new. He's, again, not speaking regarding technology. Obviously, that is, hey, this is new. But regarding the human experience, regarding the ultimate observation of human life, there is nothing new. Everything has been, and even in Solomon's time, which we would consider ancient, he refers to ancient times. It's always been the same. There is no remembrance, verse 11, of former things, nor will there be any remembrance of things that are to come by those who will come after. There is a statement or a phrase, and it's been repeated over and over again, and I used to remember who originally said it, but I can't remember right now. But those who don't learn from the past are doomed to repeat it. Okay? And this is often used as a means of enforcing upon our children the need to learn from history. Okay? Because if you forget the hard lessons that have been learned at a high price throughout history, you're going to have a tendency, and your society is going to have a tendency to make the same mistakes over and over and over again. Ironically, that still remains the case, doesn't it? People still don't tend to learn from the mistakes of it. They think, well, things have changed now. We can do this, and it wouldn't happen the same way it happened then. We wouldn't do it that way. We'll do it a different way, and we'll make it work. That's not how man has done this since the beginning of time. There is no remembrance of former things. And he's not just saying historical events. Okay, well, we can recall historical events. We have the Bible to tell us about the historical events surrounding Jesus. There are historical events we know about, and we know more closer to our own generation and century. The closer we get, we know more about it. What he's saying is the experience of man and the lessons man learns, that is what is forgotten. Because a new generation comes up, and they think they have all the answers. They think, oh, what we've come up with is new. All these old fogies, they don't know anything about this because this is new. They don't realize that, we've tried that. We've been there, we've done that. It didn't work. And certainly this is a commentary on the knowledge of parents for children as well, isn't it? And grandparents for that matter. Anything through verse 11? Yes, ma'am.
It's something personal I want to talk about. Is my daughter, oldest daughter, she used to always tell me that I was old-fashioned. She'd say, this is '80s, this is not the '60s.
Uh-huh.
And my mother would speak up and say, but it was the same thing in the '40s.
Yeah. Yep. Yep.
Nothing new under the sun.
It-
Same things can happen.
Same things, and the same ideologies, the same activities that tend to take on for each new generation a certain importance or a certain cause, they're just recycled over and over and over again. And the fact that that exists, I mean, there's no way for us to prevent it. Okay, there's no way for me to enable my grandchildren or my great-grandchildren to remember all the lessons that I've learned. I mean, I can write a book, I could write, a diary or whatever, but how many people throughout the centuries have written diaries that are no longer available, or maybe just pages are? Okay, it's not going to last. And eventually, people will just forget. And even then, just because I wrote it down, does that mean they'll actually take the advice? No. And that's part of the irony of what Solomon's saying, is that, listen, none of this stuff of the earth, none of that matters. What matters is that you fear God and keep His commandments. That's the only thing that matters, because nothing else is going to last. Anything else in verse 11? Verse 12, I, the preacher, so now he's going into first person. He's referring to his authority, and yes, he was king. Okay? Not that he isn't king now, as he's writing this, but that he's looking back on his time as king, particularly the time he was king when he was not serving God properly. That's the specific spectrum of time he's dealing with, because that's what he's going to address. I, the preacher, was king over Israel and Jerusalem. I set my heart to seek and search out by wisdom concerning all that is done under heaven. This burdensome task God has given to the sons of man, by which they may be exercised. I have seen all the works that are done under the sun, and indeed all is vanity and grasping for the wind. All right. We'll stop there with verse 13 and 14. We'll pick up here next Wednesday night. Thank you, everybody, for the thoughts and comments. I appreciate it.